Good morning, Dr. Anderson. I've already provided your CV and information, professional information to the court and to the prosecutor, so we can move right along to questions specifically about Ms. Patel. Dr. Anderson, do you know Jolly Patel?
Yes, I do.
And how do you know her?
She's been coming to see me for therapy for the past 2 years.
And what is the nature of her therapy?
Most of our work has been around building safe, healthy coping skills to manage feelings of distress, and also working on healthy conflict management.
And does Ms. Patel And does Ms. Patel, is there a clinical diagnosis that you're working with Ms. Patel on?
Yes. Yes, right now we're working under 3 diagnoses: chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, impulse control disorder, and language deprivation syndrome.
Can you please, let's start with language deprivation syndrome. Could you please tell the court about that particular syndrome?
Yes, language deprivation syndrome can occur when an individual hasn't had sufficient exposure to language during the critical period of language development, which most research shows is prior to the age of 5 years. So when someone hasn't had meaningful language exposure, whether that's through spoken language or sign language, it has a number of developmental consequences on language in and of itself, on cognitive development, and emotional and behavioral development. Language deprivation is relatively rare among hearing people because they are exposed to speech in their natural environment, but it's much more common among deaf individuals, especially those who aren't raised in signing environments.
And in general, can you please describe for the court how language deprivation syndrome manifests in general in individuals in a general sense?
So the language symptoms that you see are that even though an individual can acquire a relatively basic vocabulary, mostly nouns, some verbs, they really lack the ability to use formal grammar systems, so they never truly develop a formal language system. In terms of cognitive symptoms, individuals with language deprivation often are only able to think very concretely about here and now issues. They often struggle to talk about the past or the future in any meaningful way, and so often you see issues with storytelling or narratives, not really able to tell a complete narrative. In terms of emotional and behavioral symptoms, you often see a lot of impulsivity, difficulty thinking before acting, difficulty coping with or managing feelings of distress. I'd say those are the key symptoms.
Now, in the case of Ms. Patel specifically, how does language deprivation symptom manifest for her as an individual?
So Ms. Patel didn't receive meaningful language exposure until after the age of 7, when she moved to the United States, and it was first discovered that she was deaf, and she was placed in a deaf school. So that's the sort of the key factor that the language deprivation happened. The symptoms that we continue to see in therapy are that although she is able to connect some basic actions to their consequences. So, for example, she knows that drugs mean she gets in trouble. She doesn't have an abstract understanding of why that is. She doesn't understand why being involved with drugs gets her in trouble with the law, or she doesn't understand why drugs might be bad for you. So I'd say one of the biggest issues we see is around abstract thought. And then the second main issue that we're working on in therapy is around impulse control and when difficult emotions or conflict with others happens, how to manage that in a safe way without blowing up or taking off, but to manage it with healthy coping skills. So those are two main areas where we're working.
So Dr. Anderson, if it's a useful way to speak about it, and it may not be, but if it's useful, can you speak of Ms. Patel's functioning in terms of a grade level or intellectual level? And if so, what would that be?
I think one of the clearest ways to describe her level of linguistic and cognitive development would be to use Piaget's developmental stages. And I would say that Ms. Patel falls in the concrete operational phase of cognitive development, which for a typically developing child would be from the ages of 7 years old to 11 years old. And that stage is marked by the ability to use some very, very rudimentary logic, so that basic if-then consequence, but really no inability to think in more abstract terms. So it's typically around the age of 7 to 11 years. So I think her functioning would fall in that age range.
Now, you mentioned earlier that people dealing with language deprivation syndrome often have difficulty with narrative. In your opinion, would Ms. Patel be able to assist somebody in understanding an accurate timeline of something that had happened to her.
Your Honor, there seems to be, that there needs to be an addition to the interpretation, and can the interpreter take a moment to discuss that and add that?
Yes.
Of course. Final question. Oftentimes in court, cases are resolved with a plea, and an individual is put on probation. And so later, if they make a mistake in a way that's unrelated to the case, they might have consequences. They might have to, they might go to jail, or they might have a conviction enter on their record. You talked about language deprivation syndrome affecting individuals, and Ms. Patel specifically's ability to understand later consequences. In your opinion, if you can, do you think Ms. Patel would be able to understand that if she resolved a case with probation now, that she could get in trouble still with this case by doing by making a different mistake, getting in trouble in a different way later? Not sure I phrased that very clearly, but that's sort of the point of.
So in general, the ability to see and understand patterns is an abstract cognitive ability. And the ability to extrapolate from one specific situation in which you got in trouble to various different situations that might look very different is a very sophisticated cognitive ability. So based on what I estimate Ms. Patel's cognitive abilities to be, I think that would be extremely difficult for her.
No further questions.
Any cross-examination?
Your Honor, just for the interpreters, we have not actually completed our interpretation of the witness's response.
Fine, you may
Just have
continue.
a moment.
Counsel, whenever you're ready, you may proceed.
Good morning, Ms. Anderson. I'm Jacqueline Lee Washington, and I'm an attorney for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Good morning.
And you've been treating Ms. Patel for 2 years, correct?
Correct.
Where did you meet? Where do you meet?
In my private practice office in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Do you know where Ms. Patel lives?
Most recently, I believe she was living with her partner also in Springfield, Massachusetts.
How does she get there to your office?
She uses a variety of different strategies. Sometimes she walks if the weather's okay. Sometimes she takes public transportation. Sometimes she gets rides from other individuals. However, it seems that transportation is often an unstable factor in her life, and so she's had a lot of no-show appointments in the past 2 years.
But basically, she makes appointments and she gets to your office, correct?
We have a weekly therapy schedule, and I'd say she makes between 50 and 75% of her appointments.
And during your appointments, you are able to communicate with her, right?
Yes, we communicate I communicate in American Sign Language, and Jolly communicates in a more basic form of sign. When we started meeting 2 years ago, we also worked with a certified deaf interpreter at first to help us get more familiar with each other's communication styles and for me to really be able to match her communication. And then over time, as we found that communication was becoming more smooth, Ms. Patel and I decided that she would prefer to meet one-on-one without the certified deaf interpreter.
So she was able to help make the decision that the other interpreter was not required, right?
She was part of the decision and she was able to express that she felt it was more private with just the two of us.
Now, you testified previously that she knows that drugs.
Attorney in Washington,
I'm
can we just
sorry.
have a moment? Thank you, that's okay.
Sorry. You testified previously that she knows that drugs could get her in trouble.
Objection, Your Honor.
Basis?
Your Honor, I believe this is getting into confidential, privileged information for patients. I know the witness did testify to that generally, but I think specific questions about this particular line of questions specifically gets beyond what the questions of competence are, the question of competence that is at issue in this hearing, and is potentially prejudicial for my client.
You wish to respond?
Your Honor, I would say that it was opened the door by the counsel's, by the testimony of the defendant, and that this particular question would go into relevancy of whether she knows right from wrong.
All right, well, the question that was asked is a follow-up to a question was put by defense counsel to this witness. So I'm going to allow it. I do understand that if we get into too many specifics of specific drug incidents, that may prove problematic, and you can renew your objection at that time.
Thank you.
And what that means, Doctor, is if you understand the question, you can go ahead and answer it.
Could you repeat the question?
That's always the response.
You testified earlier that she knows that drugs could get her into trouble.
Yes, Ms. Patel has a basic understanding that in the past, drugs have led to trouble.
Has she indicated? Has she indicated who she would be in trouble with?
She's been able to describe that she gets in trouble with people wearing blue outfits who make her do this.
Oh, let that go.
So is it your understanding that she doesn't know who the police are?
That's my understanding. Sometimes when she's talking about the person in the blue outfit who makes her do this, sometimes she'll refer to that person using the sign police. Other times she'll refer to that person using the sign for judge, and other times we'll refer to that person using the sign for lawyer. So it's not clear to me that she has a consistent understanding of that person's label or their role.
In your opinion, would a person between the ages of 7 to 11 years old know the difference between right and wrong?
Objection, Your Honor.
Basis?
Beyond the scope of this witness's testimony.
Well, my impression was you asked her precisely the opposite question, but I'll hear you in response.
Yes, Your Honor, I offer that the witness has already testified to that fact, and it was never, and there was never an objection, and it was offered by the defense.
Very good. The objection is overruled. You can answer the question.
So to answer the question about whether a 7 to 11-year-old understands the difference between right and wrong, if we follow Kohlberg's theory of moral development, the most sophisticated level of moral understanding doesn't happen until about the age of 18. Most 7 to 11-year-olds, their understanding of right and wrong is basically about, do I get in trouble or not? It's very basic. It is not tied to the act in and of itself. So to answer your question, no, I don't think a 7 to an 11-year-old has a true understanding of right and wrong.
Your Honor, for the interpretation, do you mind having the witness please repeat her testimony or play back the testimony?
So we don't have the capacity to play back. Are you able to?
I'll do my
repeat?
best. So based on Kohlberg's theory of moral development, the most sophisticated understanding of right and wrong or morality doesn't happen until about the age of 18. When someone is between the age of 7 and 11, their understanding of right and wrong is basically, do I get in trouble or not? It has very little to do with whether the act in and of itself is inherently right or wrong, whether that's morally or legally. So to answer your question, no, I don't think a 7 to 11-year-old has a true understanding of right and wrong.
Would you agree that children or juveniles between the age of 7 and 11 are prosecuted in courts across this country?
Objection.
Sustained.
Nothing further.
Thank you. I would typically offer redirect, but we're going to forego that at this point.